Hey guys, welcome back to our Hometown History Extra. We just filmed episode 2.5 on the railroads going from New Freedom the whole way up to York. That will be on YouTube, available later. Now, Domi and I are here with Scott Mingus.
Hi, Scott.
Yeah.
Hi guys, nice to be here.
Scott, could you just give us a little bio on how what you've written about and what you've studied?
Oh, sure. Yeah, my background is I'm a retired scientist from the paper industry. But over the years, with multiple business trips, I started writing books. I've now written 30 books on the Underground Railroad and the Civil War, a lot of which are York County related. So it's been a great hobby, and now that I've retired, it's my full-time job.
You stay busy. You were like pumping out books.
Yeah.
Domi has a book.
I have two books.
Two books.
Yeah, two cookbooks about Newberrytown.
There you go.
Yeah, I compiled the recipes from grandmas and moms and
know.
aunts and uncles around Newberrytown.
Yeah.
So.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and we have 3 of your books here tonight, but check out the York County Library System or go on his website and buy some.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I'm personally a Civil War nerd, and I know you are too. So Jamie and I talked about the Howard Tunnel and how the Union Army guarded the Howard Tunnel from the Confederates. So do you want to talk more about that? Tell us how we stopped the Confederates from getting farther north and
Sure.
the role the railroad
Yeah,
played?
that's a great point because the Howard Tunnel, as you mentioned in your previous broadcast, is one of the oldest railroad tunnels in the United States. At the time of the Civil War, it was considered to be a very vulnerable location. So there was a lot of concern the Confederates were going to try to damage it in some format, because the key to remember is not only was this the lifeblood of York County, the Northern Central Railway was one of the key supply routes during the Civil War. And on these very tracks that are behind us, thousands and thousands of tons of war material were sent through places like New Freedom, Glen Rock, etc. So destroying the Howard Tunnel would have been a major Confederate success in stopping one of the key routes. Because keep in mind, there were only 3 routes between Maryland and Pennsylvania during the time of the Civil War. And this is one of the largest volume of those 3, and it ran in the center of those 3 railroads. So this was a bit of a key place for them to knock out. So as the Confederates are trying to take the Howard Tunnel, as you mentioned, the Pennsylvania State Militia is blocking their access through that. Confederates will eventually, a couple of days later, try to take the bridge at Wrightsville. And their goal was to cross over that, as Cody talked about in one of your previous things. And again, the state militia was able to stop them from crossing into the river. So the Confederates continue to try to go north. They're stopped by battles in what's today's Camp Hill. And so all throughout the region, everybody's turning the Confederates away, and eventually we're of course going to fight on July 1st to 3rd, the famous Battle of Gettysburg. But most people don't realize that all these small towns were where the Gettysburg campaign actually turned. And I've always said the high water mark of the Confederacy is not take its charge. It's turning in the back of Camp Hill, it's changing in Wrightsville, it's retaking Chambersburg, it's doing the little
small
things.
battles,
It's doing the little things that are going to add up to the collective goal of stopping the Confederates here in Pennsylvania.
I agree with you.
So why do you think then in York County we focus on us surrendering to the Confederates? Because we did, but then we also defended ourselves at the Howard Tunnel, and we also burnt the bridge at Wrightsville, but those stories aren't as highlighted.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. When I moved here in 2001 from Ohio,
Wait, you're not from York County? Cancel the episode.
No.
Locals only.
Locals
Who knows
only.
more about York County than people that were born and raised here? So.
And actually, my 5th great-grandfather, a member of the Alt family from the paper mill, is actually buried in Prospect Hill Cemetery. So I am
Okay,
I
all
am
right.
in York
We'll
County.
let it pass this time.
That's okay. But the bottom line is, I was surprised when I moved here that there wasn't a lot more emphasis on all the good things. Because nationally, the folks in the Civil War community certainly knew the importance of what happened in York County, what happened in Cumberland County, things like that. They're part of the general histories. And surprisingly, outside of York County, they don't talk a lot about the surrender of York. Most national books only have a sentence, if anything, about it.
It's a local
So I think,
hang-up.
I think exactly. I think it's really more of a local hang-up than it is.
Interesting.
And I find when I give Civil War tours all over the country and give talks in a lot of different states, and I start mentioning, sometimes to people, York was the largest town to surrender in the North, and they're like, really?
Yeah,
It's
right,
just
right.
not that well known.
No,
Right.
and I don't think people really picture York as being that large either.
That's also
Right,
true.
Right. So
That's
they're like,
also a
oh,
good
that
point.
small little place? Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So moving farther into the Civil War, let's talk about the Lincoln funeral train
Sure.
that went through Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a fascinating topic because we know Abraham Lincoln was, of course, assassinated on April 14th.
Yeah.
At that point in American history, we didn't obviously have Marine One or Air Force One because flying transportation didn't exist. The government started building its own, what was going to be Railroad One, which would have been a dedicated railroad car for the President of the United States usage. Lincoln had never been on this new car.
Right.
It was still not totally finished, being built in Alexandria, Virginia. And he was scheduled to go on the car on April 22nd. Well, he's shot on April 14th.
Right.
He dies on it the next morning. And on April 21st, he's on the funeral car because they took Railroad One, if you will, to use a modern term they didn't use then. And they modified it they put the casket in there, pulled out a lot of the furniture and stuff. And then they're going to take Lincoln's body almost 1,600 miles
Wow.
back to Springfield, Illinois, where
Right.
his wife wanted him and one of their sons. So when you talk about the Lincoln funeral train, it's also the funeral train for one of his children. So
Yeah.
the Lincoln's coffin's in one room, and in the back room is the coffin of his son, William Wallace Lincoln, who goes through York County. So on April 19th and 20th, the president's body is displayed in Washington. On 21st, it's brought to Baltimore on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. And it's then brought here to York County, leaving Baltimore at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of April 21st. And it's going on these very tracks that we keep talking
Right,
about.
and there was bulletins, so people knew when the train was going
They
to
did.
arrive so that they could gather and see the train and see, well, they wanted to see the president.
That's really neat.
Yeah, the chief purchaser of York, a guy by the name of David Small, was also the editor of the local newspaper. And they printed up broadsides with the actual railroad schedule.
Right.
They posted them all over the county so people knew that, all right, at 6:40 it's going to arrive in York. At 5:30 it'll be at Hanover Junction. So people knew that, and they lined the tracks. Even here in Railroad, on New Freedom, places like that, they were lining the tracks, dressed in their Sunday best black clothing, funeral clothing. In a rainstorm, as the rain's starting to come down, they're still out there in an area, to your point on politics, that did not vote for Lincoln.
That's what I was
Right,
wondering.
right.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, West Manheim Township, you guys know where that is, obviously down near Hanover, voted 174 votes for the slave-owning Vice President of the United States, John Breckinridge. And each of you raise up one finger. There's the total number of votes that Abraham Lincoln had in West Manheim Township, too.
I wonder who those two people were.
Yeah, we don't know. You know.
It would have been me if I
Yeah.
Yeah, it probably would have been. But the funny thing is, this is an area that obviously was heavily Democrat. Was very.
Yes.
It was not only that; it was very anti-Lincoln in some of these areas. They weren't ambivalent; they were anti-Lincoln. And yet, for all these people to be out, hat in hand, in the rain, for a guy they didn't vote for,
Right.
showed a tremendous amount of character, I think, for a lot of U.S.
And
County
respect.
citizens. Yeah.
And do you think that the tide changed during the Civil War as far as their feelings toward Lincoln? Or why do you think they ended up coming out?
Well, I don't think the tide changed. In fact, they voted more against Lincoln in 1864
Yeah.
than they did in 1860.
Right.
But I think there were really two things. One, York Countyans, I found even today, are a decent folk.
Woo-hoo! Hear that, everybody? We're
But,
decent.
they have morals,
Right.
and they have compassion. And this is a man and his child
Yeah.
who are
Right.
dead, who are coming through your area, and as a sign of respect,
the right
even
thing to
today,
do.
it's the right thing to do. And secondly, there was a lot more respect in those days for the office.
Right.
That's what I was thinking.
People may not have necessarily liked Lincoln. He's the president of the United States, and it's your duty as an American to at least come out and do that. And most people did, although there were some exceptions. So down in Round Hill, there was a guy who was actually arrested for disloyalty because he bragged that served Lincoln right. He should have been shot 4 years ago.
Oh, no.
So you had these,
Right.
little.
But he was arrested, you said?
He was actually arrested
For
for
saying that?
disloyalty. For
Yeah.
disloyalty.
Is that because we were at war?
Yeah, the government felt that anything that you said that was contrary to the war effort could be used against you as, maybe you're a sympathizer or something to the
Isn't that
South.
interesting
So-
how individual freedoms and rights change for national security during
yeah.
times of war?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's never really changed.
Right,
So.
right. Was Mary Todd with him on the train?
No, she wasn't. Mary Todd Lincoln was so shook up by the event of, keep in mind she's had 2 children die in the White House. She's had a severe concussion during the Gettysburg campaign when her carriage has flipped over, hitting her head. Now the shock of her husband being killed right next to her on a night they're supposed to be enjoying a play to relax. The war's almost over, and she loses it. So she doesn't go on the train, and their remaining eldest son, Robert Todd Lincoln, will stay with Mary Lincoln after he makes sure all the arrangements have been made. So there's not actually a member of Abraham Lincoln's family, not a single member is on the train, although some of Mary Todd's distant relatives, cousins, things like that, brother-in-laws, were on the train. So that's as close as we came to having Lincoln family members.
Yeah, that's something you wouldn't hear about today.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And you wouldn't be able to get that close. I mean, now we have presidents that lie in state at the Capitol, but they're not being brought on trains through towns and stopping at the railway station for you to come up to the train and pay your respects.
So sometimes as a historian, I'm walking down this rail trail and I am overwhelmed with the sensories of the birds chirping even right now. I mean, we're at the Creek House and you can hear birds chirping and the creek is flowing and the crabs at Captain Bob's smell delicious and the chickens are scratching. And so I try to imagine what it was like in history. I try to think of Howard Tunnel with the soldiers on top of the hill. I try to picture Abraham Lincoln going 50 feet from where we are. When you walk down the rail trail, like, what do you see?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I tend to see the Civil War, of course. You're using the phrase Civil War nerd, of course.
It's a good thing.
It's a good thing, yeah. It's a good thing. But yeah, I tend to picture that. I mean, it's funny. I actually, a lot of times as I'm flying around the country or driving around the country, we'll picture towns and try to think, what did it actually look like during the war years? I mean, there was this building here. How was it modified? What did it look like? Does it have history? Who lived there? Because the one thing that I've become really interested in studying York County Civil War history is the people. And I've tried to really focus a lot on human interest stories. And what were the people doing? What were they thinking? What was happening in their lives? Because I think too often, and you know this from a lot of the Civil War boards that you're on and I'm on, too many people refight the Civil War using today's lenses.
Right, and you can't do that.
You really can't do that because this is a different world these people live in.
Yeah.
It's a totally different world. We think it's a long time ago, and it was. But these folks had different values. They had, different relationships. There was a much more rural lifestyle.
A slower pace of
slower
life.
pace of life. And so I try to think, how did this war impact these folks? And what was happening in their lives? Because you got to keep in mind, in a lot of these small towns along the roads here, their boys are off to war. Some of them aren't coming back. 500 or 600 of them.
It's emotional.
Never come back. It's a highly emotional time in American history. But yeah, I try to think a lot about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think more people when they're on the rail trail should have history in the back of their mind.
Like their lenses.
Yeah, it's not just a place for recreation.
Yeah,
it can
that's
teach
part of
you
the reason.
something.
That's part of the reason we wrote that one book that you had, the history of the rail trail, because we wanted folks to envision. Because my co-author Robert Williams has put in there track plans of what these little communities would have looked like back in 1905, 1910, 1920, in the railroad's heyday, when the railroad was really the lifeblood of what was going on here. And so we wanted people to actually take that on the rail trail. And walk along the trail and stop in these small towns, in Sightsland, in LaRue, in Smizer Station, Flatwater Station, places like that, and envision what was it like for these people, and how did they react, and how important was this railroad? Because today we just blow by on the highways and never stop to think that the railroad, to your point earlier, was the connectivity, and in some ways was the modernization of a lot of these areas.
We should narrate the book so people can listen to it as they're walking down the rail trail.
Really good at that.
So one thing that we skipped over in our episode was Hanover Junction.
Sure.
Yeah, so we were hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about that special place.
Yeah, I mean, Hanover Junction is kind of a show place on the rail trail, of course. A lot of the activities center around there. It's always been a very key part of the railroad network in York County. As I'm sure you guys realize, the first railroad in York came through in 1838. 1839 was the year it really first took off in great degree. But they built two spurs. One went from York out to Wrightsville in the early 1840s or so. And then in 1851-52 time frame, they decided to build a railroad that went to Hanover. And so they decided to buy some property along the northern central, staked it out, bought an existing house, modified it, put up a depot, and had train tracks that ran off to Hanover. And then eventually during the Civil War, they went either south to Littlestown or west to Gettysburg. And they connected back at Hanover Junction. So that was a station that was physically owned by what was called the Hanover Branch Railroad, but it became a very key part of the train station here. And as we know, Abraham Lincoln stopped here on his way to deliver the Gettysburg Address. May or may not have been photographed in front of the Hanover Junction
I've
station.
seen that image. What do you think?
No.
You don't think it was him?
No.
Ah.
No, actually, one book in there, I've got about 10 pages on why it's not Lincoln. But,
Interesting.
you know,
Go buy that book.
Yeah, but that's controversial. Yeah, highly controversial. But you know, the bottom line on Hanover Junction is it provided an outlet after the Battle of Gettysburg. They had 11,000 wounded boys, north and south, that were brought by rail out of Gettysburg, out of these temporary field hospitals, to Hanover Junction. And from there, they were staged, put on other trains, either sent south to Baltimore and Washington, or sent north to York and on to Harrisburg, Philadelphia, New York City, even as far away as Boston in those areas. So Hanover Junction became kind of a refuge center where the U.S. Christian Commission, the U.S. Sanitary Commission came and they fed. For many of these wounded men, it was the first decent meal they'd had.
Wow.
After being, shot at Gettysburg, they were laying in field hospitals. Now they're finally well enough to get on a train, and now they're going to get food while they're sitting in Hanover Junction. So the train station plays a pretty important role throughout that. And it's my first talk about experience. My first experience with the Civil War in York County was attending the rededication of the Hanover Junction train station in the fall of 2001 after I moved here. Being a Civil War, nerd or geek or whatever you want to say, or author in my case, and yours as well. It was kind of fun to learn some of the history, and that's where I kind of started getting hooked. That and Jim McClure's books that I happened to be reading at about the same time started filling me in on the history, and I frankly got hooked. And then, just finish up the story, my oldest son decides to move out here, get his master's in history from Millersville on his way to becoming a history professor. And guess what he did his master's thesis on? The burning of the Wrightsville Bridge.
Oh, really?
Which, of course, became then my pet passion, and my first national book was on the burning of the Wrightsville
So you're
Bridge.
saying Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays in your family is a lot of talking about history.
Yeah, actually no, because I've got two sons who are both college history professors, one with a PhD, the other one a master's in history. My daughter-in-law has a degree in history and is a teacher.
Oh my gosh.
And my daughter worked with me at the paper industry, so our meals on the holidays are no paper making and no Civil War.
Off limits. Can't talk about that.
Can't talk about those.
The whole family affair.
Yeah, we can talk about sex, drugs, politics, whatever else, but no Civil War and no paper making.
Too contentious for that.
God bless your wife.
God bless her. She's a saint.
I love it.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have any more questions for him?
Thank you, Scott, for joining
No problem.
us.
I appreciate it.
Yeah,
Thanks, guys.
it's been
This
enjoying
has been
talking with you.
great. Yeah.
If you want to go and watch our other videos, they're on Facebook Live and YouTube. Again, we're Hometown History. I'm Jamie.
I'm Domi.
See you guys next time.
Thanks, guys.
See ya.
That was great. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Oh, you guys are super. You guys are absolutely stupid.